My name is Diane Calloway. I am 45 years old, and I want to tell you something before this story begins. I am not a vengeful person. I have never been the kind of woman who keeps score, who holds grudges, who waits in the dark for the right moment to strike back. I am the kind of woman who shows up, who drives 3 hours on a Tuesday night because someone needs help, who sits in hospital waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse lighting for weeks at a time without being asked, who folds the laundry and fills the prescriptions and calls the insurance company on hold for 45 minutes so that the person she loves doesn't have to. That is who I am. And for most of my life, that was enough. My mother, Eleanor Calloway, was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer in the spring of 2021. She was 74 years old. She lived alone in the house in Savannah, Georgia, where my sister Sandra and I had grown up. A white clapboard house on Hartridge Street with a magnolia tree in the front yard that Daddy had planted the year I was born. I moved back to Savannah 6 weeks after the diagnosis. Left my job in Charlotte. Put my condo on the market. Packed what fit in my Subaru and drove south on I-77 because my mother needed someone and Sandra said she couldn't leave Phoenix right now. Couldn't leave Phoenix right now. I thought about that sentence for the entire 9-hour drive. I became my mother's everything for the next 14 months. Her driver, her nurse, her grocery shopper, her hand to hold at 3 a.m. when the pain got bad enough to make her cry. And Sandra called on Sundays. Sometimes. Then my mother got a little better. And Sandra flew in for a long weekend. And somewhere in those 4 days, everything changed. I didn't know it yet. I was too busy being the daughter who stayed to notice what the daughter who visited was doing. 3 months later, my mother passed quietly on a Wednesday morning in September. I was holding her hand. Sandra was on a flight from Phoenix. She landed 2 hours after. The funeral was on a Saturday. The will reading was the following Tuesday. And when that lawyer opened the envelope and started reading, Sandra's face did something I had never seen it do before in 36 years of being her sister. It went completely white. I need to tell you about my mother first, because you cannot understand what Sandra did without understanding who Eleanor Calloway was. Mom was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family without writing any of them down, who made biscuits from scratch every Sunday morning, even after her knees started giving her trouble, who kept a drawer in the kitchen full of birthday cards she had already bought for occasions that hadn't happened yet, because she liked to be prepared. She was 74 years old, and she had lived in that house on Hartridge Street for 41 years. Since before I was born. Since before Sandra was born. Since my father Thomas brought her there as a young bride from Macon and planted that magnolia tree in the front yard, because she had mentioned once that she loved them. Dad passed in 2014. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you should have said years ago. After that it was just Mom. In that house. With her garden and her church friends and her Tuesday night bridge club, and the 2 daughters she had raised to be completely different people in ways that I don't think she ever fully understood. Sandra is 2 years older than me. 40 now. And growing up she was the one who got out first. Left Savannah at 18 for Arizona State. Met her husband Kevin out there. Settled in Phoenix. Built a life that looked successful from the outside in the particular way that lives in warm climates with nice cars always do. I stayed closer to home. Went to UNC Charlotte. Studied nursing. Settled in Charlotte, which was close enough to Savannah that I could drive down for holidays without it being a production. I called Mom every Tuesday and Thursday. Without fail. For 15 years. Sandra called when she remembered. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it matters for what comes later. When the diagnosis came in April 2021, I was working as a charge nurse at Atrium Health in Charlotte. Good job. Stable. The kind of work that exhausts you in ways that also make you feel like your life means something. I drove to Savannah the weekend after the diagnosis. Sat at the kitchen table with Mom while she explained what the oncologist had said. Stage 3. Ovarian. Treatment options. Surgery first, then chemotherapy. Mom was calm the way she always was. Practical. She had her notepad out with questions she had already written down for the next appointment. I looked at her sitting there in that kitchen she had cooked 10,000 meals in, and I made a decision without saying it out loud. I called Sandra that night. I told her what was happening. She was upset. Of course she was. She cried. Said she couldn't believe it. Said she was going to come as soon as she could get time off work. I said, Sandra, Mom is going to need real help. Consistent help. Not visits. She said. I know, Diane. I know. I just need to figure out the logistics. Kevin's schedule is complicated right now and the kids have school and... I listened to the logistics for 20 minutes. Then I said, I'm moving back to Savannah. Silence. You don't have to do that, she said. Someone has to, I said. Another silence. Then she said, You're a better person than me, Diane. I mean that. I didn't feel like a better person. I felt like the only option. 6 weeks later, I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom with a resignation letter submitted and a condo listed, and my entire Charlotte life packed into a storage unit on I-485. Mom cried when I pulled into the driveway with my Subaru full of boxes. She said, Diane Marie Calloway, you did not have to do this. I said, I know, Mama. I wanted to. That was the truth. And it was also the most expensive truth I have ever told. The first 3 months were the hardest medically. Surgery in May. 6 hours in the operating room at Memorial Health in Savannah. I sat in that waiting room alone with a cup of coffee that went cold and a magazine I didn't read a single word of for the entire time. Sandra had booked a flight. Her layover in Dallas got canceled. She called me from the Phoenix airport at 11 a.m. crying, and I talked her through it calmly the way I talked patients through difficult moments at work, because that was the only mode I had available to me that day. The surgeon came out at 2:47 p.m. He said the procedure went well. They had removed the primary tumor. Margins looked clean. Chemotherapy would start in 6 weeks. I called Sandra from the parking garage. She answered on the first ring. How is she? Sandra said. She's okay, I said. Surgery went well. Sandra exhaled. Oh, thank God. Oh, thank God, Diane. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. I said, It's okay, Sandra. It wasn't okay. But I said it anyway because my mother was in recovery and I didn't have the energy for anything else. Chemotherapy started in July. Every Tuesday and Friday I drove Mom to the Moss Cancer Center on Duran Avenue. Sat with her through the infusions. Brought her ginger ale and saltines because those were the only things her stomach tolerated afterward. Drove her home. Made sure she ate something. Made sure she took her medications in the right order at the right times. I had her medication schedule taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. Color-coded. Because I was a nurse and because I knew that chemo brain was real and that Mom needed someone whose brain was working clearly to manage the details. I managed all of them. Sandra sent flowers in July. A beautiful arrangement from a florist in Scottsdale. Mom put them on the kitchen table and said, Wasn't that sweet of Sandra? I said, Yes, Mama. Very sweet. I refilled Mom's prescriptions that afternoon. Drove to the Walgreens on Abercorn Street. Waited 20 minutes for the pharmacy. Paid $47 out of pocket for the one the insurance didn't fully cover. I didn't mention that part to anyone. By September, Mom was responding well to treatment. The oncologist used the word encouraging. Said the tumor markers were moving in the right direction. That if she continued to respond, well, they might be looking at remission by spring. Mom cried at that appointment. The good kind of crying. I squeezed her hand in the passenger seat on the way home, and she looked at me and said, What would I do without you, Diane? I said, You'll never have to find out, Mama. I meant that with everything I had. Sandra called that Sunday. I told her about the encouraging news. She was so relieved she could barely speak. She said, I'm going to come visit. Soon. I promise. I just need to get through the holidays, and then Kevin and I are going to figure out the schedule, and I'll come for a real visit. Not just a weekend. I said, That would be wonderful, Sandra. She came in February. 4 days. She and Kevin flew in together. Stayed at a hotel on River Street because I was in the guest room and the house only had 2 bedrooms. Those 4 days felt different from the moment she arrived. Not because Sandra was different exactly, but because Mom was different around her. Lighter somehow. Performing a version of herself that she didn't perform for me anymore. The version that had energy and laughed easily and didn't mention the bad nights or the pain that still came in waves or the fear that lived underneath the encouraging test results. I understood it. When you see someone every day, they see the real you. When someone visits, you show them the best you. But Sandra wasn't seeing the real picture. And I think, looking back, she made decisions based on the picture she saw during those 4 days. Decisions I wouldn't find out about until it was too late to do anything about them. On Sandra's last night in Savannah, the 3 of us sat on the back porch after dinner. Mom's sweet tea. The Savannah evening air doing that particular thing it does in February, where it's almost warm enough to forget it's winter. Mom looked at both of us and said, "I want you girls to know that whatever happens, I am so proud of both of you. So proud." Sandra reached over and took Mom's hand. I watched them sitting there together, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Left out, in my own childhood home, caring for my own mother. I felt like the visitor. I pushed it down, told myself I was tired, that I was reading into things. I was tired. I was reading into things. But I wasn't wrong. Sandra left on a Sunday morning. I drove her and Kevin to the Savannah Hilton Head International Airport at 6 a.m. because their flight was early and Mom couldn't drive anymore and Sandra hadn't rented a car. Kevin slept in the back seat the whole way. Sandra sat in the front and talked about how good Mom looked, how encouraging the visit had been, how she felt so much better having seen her in person. I nodded, kept my eyes on I-516. At the departures drop-off, Sandra hugged me longer than usual. She said, "You are doing an incredible thing, Diane. I hope you know that." I said, "I know, Sandra. Drive safe." She said, "I'll call more. I promise." She did call more. For about 3 weeks. Then it went back to Sundays. Sometimes. March came. Mom's test results continued to improve. The oncologist used the word remission for the first time at her April appointment. Cautious remission. Early. But real. Mom cried again at that appointment. So did I. I called Sandra from the car outside the cancer center. She answered immediately. "Remission," I said. Sandra made a sound I had never heard from her before. Something between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, Diane. Oh my God. Oh, thank God." We stayed on the phone for 20 minutes. Just the two of us. Talking about Mom the way we had talked about her when we were teenagers, staying up too late on summer nights. Like sisters. Like the people we used to be before distance and different lives and 14 months of imbalance had built something between us that neither of us had officially named. It was the best conversation I had with Sandra in years. I should have known it wouldn't last. Because here is the thing about remission that nobody tells you when the oncologist says the word. Remission is not the end of the story. It is a chapter break. A pause. A moment where you exhale and lower your guard and start to believe that maybe the worst is actually behind you. And then sometimes, the cancer comes back. Mom's did. October 2022. 18 months after the original diagnosis. Different location this time. The oncologist said it with the particular careful steadiness of someone delivering news they have delivered many times before. Metastatic. The lymph nodes now. Treatment options more limited. The goal shifting from cure to management. I sat in that office and listened and took notes on my phone the way I always did, and asked the clinical questions I knew to ask because I was a nurse and because asking questions was the only thing that made me feel like I had any control at all. Mom sat very still through the whole appointment. On the drive home, she looked out the passenger window at the Savannah marsh going past on the highway and said, "Diane, I want to go home." I said, "We're going home, Mama." She said, "No, I want to die at home. Not in a hospital. Not in a facility. At home. In my house. That's what I want." I looked at the road ahead. I said, "Okay, Mama. That's what we'll do." She reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift. Neither of us said anything else the rest of the drive. That night I called Sandra. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything the oncologist had said. Every detail. The metastasis. The lymph nodes. The shift in treatment goals. Mom's wish to stay home. Sandra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm coming, Diane. This time I'm actually coming." I said, "Okay, Sandra." She said, at this time. I'll book the flight tomorrow." She booked it that week. One-way ticket from Phoenix to Savannah. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October with 2 large suitcases and Kevin nowhere in sight. She walked through the front door of the house on Hartridge Street and hugged Mom for a long time in the entryway. Then she looked around the house. And something in her expression shifted in a way I noticed but couldn't quite read. Like she was seeing the house differently than she had before. Not as the place where Mom lived. As the place where Mom was going to leave things behind. I told myself I was reading into it again. I wasn't. Sandra settled in quickly. That's the word I kept using in my head those first few days. Settled. Like she belonged there. Like the house had been waiting for her specifically and was now rearranging itself to accommodate her presence. She took over the kitchen on day 2. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just naturally. The way Sandra did everything. She reorganized the spice cabinet because she said she couldn't find anything. She moved the coffee maker to the other counter because the light was better there. She bought new dish towels from the Publix on Abercorn because the old ones were worn through. Small things. Reasonable things. The kind of things you do when you're settling into a space. I noticed every single one of them. Mom loved it. She sat at the kitchen table while Sandra cooked, and they talked the way they used to talk when we were kids. Sandra telling stories about Phoenix and Kevin, and the grandchildren Mom adored and hadn't seen in person since before the first diagnosis. I sat at that table too. Mostly I listened. The hospice team started coming the second week of November. A nurse named Patricia who reminded me of every competent, compassionate colleague I had ever worked with. A chaplain named Reverend Michael who had the particular gift of sitting in hard silence without filling it unnecessarily. I coordinated everything with Patricia. Medication schedules. Comfort measures. The overnight protocol for when Mom's pain increased. Sandra made the sweet tea and kept the kitchen clean and sat with Mom in the afternoons watching Wheel of Fortune the way they always had. We had divided without discussing it. I handled the medical. Sandra handled the comfort. It worked. In its way it worked. But something else was happening that I couldn't see yet. Mom had good days and bad days. On the good days she was almost herself. Sitting up. Eating a little. Talking about the garden and what needed to be done in the spring, and whether the magnolia tree needed trimming. On the bad days she slept mostly. The pain medication keeping her somewhere between sleep and waking. On those days Sandra and I would sit on opposite ends of the living room and not talk much. One evening in mid-November Sandra said, "Diane, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Do you know what Mom's plans are? For the house? For everything?" I looked at her. I said, "She has a will, Sandra. It was drawn up after Dad passed. I helped her update it 2 years ago when she redid her advance directive." Sandra nodded slowly, like she was processing information she already had. She said, "Right. Do you know what's in it?" I said, "I know the basics." She wanted everything divided equally between us. The house. The accounts. Everything split down the middle. Sandra said, "That seems fair." I said, "Yes, it does." She didn't say anything else that night. But the following Tuesday, while I was at the pharmacy picking up Mom's medications, Sandra asked Mom if she could call the attorney. I found out about it 3 days later when Mom mentioned it casually at breakfast. She said, Sandra called Harold about coming by next week. Harold Briggs, Mom's estate attorney, had handled everything since Daddy died. I said, "What for Mama?" Mom looked at her oatmeal. She said, "Sandra thinks we should review the will. Make sure everything is current." She said it's just good practice. I looked at my mother's face. She wasn't looking at me. That was the first time something cold moved through my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the particular feeling you get when something shifts slightly out of place, and you can't tell yet how far it's going to move. I said, "Okay, Mama. That's fine." I said it calmly, the way I said everything. But that evening I called my own attorney. A woman named Catherine Morse. Estate law. Recommended by a colleague in Charlotte 2 years earlier when I had helped Mom update her documents. I told Catherine what Sandra had done, what Mom had said. Catherine listened. Then she said, "Diane, your mother has the right to change her will at any time as long as she is of sound mind. If she is being influenced by someone to make changes that don't reflect her actual wishes, that is a different matter entirely." I said, "How do I know which one it is?" Catherine said, "You watch. You document. And you call me the moment anything changes." I said, "Okay." She said, "Diane, how is your mother's cognitive state right now?" Honestly, I thought about Mom at breakfast that morning. Not meeting my eyes. The way she had said Sandra thinks we should review the will, like she was repeating something she had been told rather than something she had decided. I said, "She has good days and bad days. The pain medication affects her clarity on the bad days." Catherine said, "I understand. Keep watching. And Diane, make sure you are present for that meeting with Harold Briggs." I intended to be. Sandra made sure I wasn't. The meeting with Harold Briggs was scheduled for a Thursday at 2 p.m. I know because I saw the calendar reminder on Mom's phone when I was helping her with her medications that Wednesday morning. November 17th, 2 p.m. Harold Briggs Estate Review. I wrote it in my own calendar immediately. That Thursday morning I woke up at 6 a.m. the way I always did. Made coffee. Checked Mom's overnight medication log that Patricia the hospice nurse left each evening. Everything normal. Mom was having a decent morning. Sitting up. Drinking her tea. The morning light coming through the kitchen window the way it always did in November in Savannah. That particular low golden light that made everything look softer than it was. Sandra came downstairs at 8 a.m., dressed already, which was unusual. Sandra was not typically addressed by 8 in person. She said, "Morning. How'd she sleep?" I said, "Reasonably well. Patricia's notes look good." Sandra poured herself coffee, leaned against the counter. She said, "Diane, I need to ask you a favor." I looked at her over my mug. She said, "Mom has an appointment with Harold today. I'm going to take her. Just the two of us. I think she'd feel more comfortable that way. Less overwhelming with both of us there." I set my mug down on the counter. Less overwhelming. My mother had stage 4 metastatic ovarian cancer and had been managed by a 2-person caregiving system for 14 months, and Sandra was telling me that having both her daughters present for a legal appointment would be overwhelming. I said, "Sandra, I should be there for anything related to Mom's estate." Sandra said, "It's just a review, Diane. Harold's been her attorney for 20 years. It's not a big deal. Mom just wants it to be low-key." I said, "Did Mom say that?" Sandra said, "We talked about it last night. She's comfortable with it being just us." I looked at my sister standing in our mother's kitchen in her already dressed clothes at 8 a.m. on the morning of a legal appointment she had scheduled without telling me. I said, "I want to be there, Sandra." Sandra said, "Diane, please. Mom needs this to feel calm. You know how she gets overwhelmed. Let me do this one thing." She said it with that particular Sandra tone. Warm. Reasonable. The tone that made you feel like disagreeing would be the unreasonable thing to do. I had heard that tone my entire life. I said, "Fine." The single worst decision I made in this entire story. They left at 1:30 p.m. Mom in her good blue cardigan. Sandra holding her arm down the porch steps. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them back out of the driveway. Then I called Catherine Morse. Catherine answered immediately. I told her what was happening. The appointment. Sandra taking Mom alone. The way it had been arranged without my knowledge. Catherine was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Diane, I need you to listen to me carefully. Call Harold Briggs' office right now. Tell them you are Eleanor Calloway's daughter and you are requesting to be present for today's appointment. You have every right to make that request." I said, "Sandra said Mom wants it to be just them." Catherine said, "Your mother can confirm that herself when you call. But you need to make the call, Diane. Right now. Before that appointment starts." I picked up my phone. Found Harold Briggs' number in Mom's contacts. Called. The receptionist answered. I said, "This is Diane Calloway, Eleanor Calloway's daughter. I understand my mother has an appointment this afternoon. I'd like to be present for it." A pause. The receptionist said, "One moment, please." 45 seconds of hold music. Then she came back. She said, "Ms. Calloway, I spoke with Mr. Briggs. He says your mother called this morning and requested that today's meeting be private. Just herself and your sister Sandra." The kitchen was very quiet around me. Mom had called. That morning, while I was checking the medication log. I said, "I understand. Thank you." I hung up. Stood at the kitchen window for a long moment. Mom's magnolia tree in the front yard. Daddy had planted it the year I was born. It was tall now. Fully grown. The kind of tree that had been there so long it was simply part of the landscape. I picked up my phone and sent Catherine a text. Mom called ahead. Requested private meeting. Just Sandra. Catherine replied in 4 minutes. Document everything from this point forward. Dates. Times. Conversations. Everything. I opened a new note on my phone. Titled it, November 17th. And I started writing. They came home at 4:15 p.m. I heard the car in the driveway. Heard the front door. Heard Sandra's voice doing that warm, steady thing it did when she was managing a situation carefully. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to read something. Mom came in first, moving slowly the way she always did now. That careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body had become something to navigate rather than something that simply worked. She looked at me and smiled. That smile. My mother's smile that I had known for 38 years. Warm and specific and entirely hers. She said, Hey baby. You eat anything? I said. I'm fine, Mama. How was your afternoon? She said. Good. Tired now. Think I'll lie down before supper. I helped her to her room. Got her settled. Made sure her afternoon medications were taken. Pulled the blinds against the late afternoon light. She held my hand for a moment before I left. She said, You are such a good girl, Diane. You always have been. I said, Rest, Mama. I'll check on you in an hour. I went back to the kitchen. Sandra was standing at the counter making tea. Her back to me. I sat down at the table. I said, How did it go? Sandra said, Fine. Good. Harold is thorough as always. I said, Did anything change? A pause. Small. Almost invisible. Sandra said, Mom just wanted to make sure everything was current. You know how she is about having things in order. I said, Sandra, did anything change in the will? Sandra turned around, mug in both hands. That expression on her face that I recognized from 40 years of being her sister. The one she wore when she had already decided what she was going to say and was measuring how much of the truth it contained. She said, Mom made some adjustments. It's her will, Diane. She has the right to do that. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, What kind of adjustments? Sandra said, I think Mom should be the one to tell you that. It's her decision. I don't want to speak for her. I looked at my sister. This woman I had shared a childhood with. Shared holidays with. Shared the weight of our father's death with. Shared 14 months of our mother's illness within completely unequal measure. I said, Sandra, tell me what changed. She set her mug down. She said, The house is going to me. Diane, Mom wants me to have the house. The financial accounts are still split equally. But the house. She wants it to stay in the family, and she feels like I'm the one who will maintain that. I said nothing. Sandra said, I know this is hard to hear. But it was her decision. I didn't ask her for it. We were just talking and she brought it up herself, and Harold helped her formalize it, and I said, Sandra. She stopped. I said, The house on Hartridge Street has been in our family for 41 years. Daddy built his life in that house. Mama has lived there since before I was born. And you have been here for 3 weeks. Sandra said, Diane. I said, I left my job. I left my home. I have been here for 14 months. I have driven her to every appointment. I have managed every medication. I have been here every single night, including the nights when the pain was bad enough that she cried and you were in Phoenix. My voice was steady. I want you to know that. It was completely steady. Sandra said, I know what you've done, Diane. Nobody is saying you haven't. I said, And in 3 weeks you convinced our dying mother to give you the house. Sandra's jaw tightened. She said, I did not convince her of anything. It was her idea. I looked at my sister for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone from the table. Opened my notes app. Added 3 lines under November 17th. Sandra confirmed will change. House to Sandra. Accounts split equally. Claims it was Mom's idea. Sandra watched me type. She said, What are you doing? I said, Documenting. She said, Diane, don't make this into something it isn't. I said, I'm not making it into anything, Sandra. I'm writing down what happened. The way I've been writing down everything since the day you scheduled that appointment without telling me. Something moved across Sandra's face. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than that. She said, Mom is dying, Diane. Can we please not do this right now? I said, I agree completely. We should not be doing this right now. I closed my laptop. Stood up. I said, I'm going to check on Mom. And I walked out of the kitchen. That night after Mom was settled and Sandra had gone to her room, I sat on the back porch in the November dark and called Catherine Morse. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. Every word. Every detail. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she said, Diane, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. In your professional assessment, as a nurse who has been present with your mother daily, do you believe your mother is currently capable of making fully independent decisions without being influenced by whoever is in the room with her? I looked at the dark Savannah yard, the magnolia tree a shadow against the night sky. I thought about Mom at breakfast that morning. Not meeting my eyes. The way she had said Sandra thinks we should. Like she was repeating something rather than deciding something. I thought about her hand in mine before her nap. You are such a good girl, Diane. You always have been. Not. I made a decision today that I want to tell you about. Just, you are such a good girl. I said. No, Catherine. I don't think she is. Catherine said. Then we have work to do. Catherine moved quickly. That's what I remember most about the days after that phone call. The speed of it. The way a legal process that I had assumed would take months started moving in ways I could barely keep up with while simultaneously managing my mother's care and living in the same house as my sister. Catherine filed a formal written objection with Harold Briggs' office on a Monday morning, notifying him that the competency of Eleanor Calloway at the time of the will amendment was being questioned by her daughter Diane Calloway, and that any further changes to estate documents should be paused pending evaluation. Harold called me personally that afternoon. He was professional, careful, the tone of a man who had practiced estate law in Savannah for 30 years and had seen versions of this situation before. He said, "Diane, I want you to know that I took considerable care with your mother's capacity assessment before proceeding with the amendment." She was lucid. She answered my questions clearly. She knew what she was signing. I said, "Harold, my mother is on palliative doses of hydromorphone for pain management. Her lucidity varies significantly depending on the time of day and when her last dose was administered." "What time was the appointment?" A pause. He said, 2 o'clock. I said, "Her midday medication is administered at noon. Peak sedative effect is typically between 1 and 3 p.m. She would have been at her least cognitively sharp during that exact window." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "I see." I said, "I'm not questioning your professionalism, Harold. I'm questioning the timing. And I'm asking you to pause any further changes until we can get an independent capacity assessment." He said, "I think that's a reasonable request, Diane. I'll hold any further documentation pending that evaluation." I said, "Thank you, Harold." I hung up and wrote it all in my notes. Time, date, every word. Catherine had also recommended a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Anita Sharma at Memorial Health, who specialized in capacity evaluations for elderly patients with terminal diagnoses. I called her office that same Monday afternoon. Dr. Sharma's earliest appointment was in 10 days. 10 days felt like a very long time. Sandra figured out something was happening by Wednesday. I don't know exactly how. Maybe Harold called her. Maybe she noticed something in my behavior. Sandra had always been good at reading rooms, even when she was the one who had made them uncomfortable. She came and found me in the backyard on a Wednesday evening while Mom was resting. She said, "Diane, did you contact Harold's office?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I have concerns about the timing and circumstances of the will change, and I think an independent evaluation is appropriate." Sandra's expression shifted. That warmth going somewhere else. Something harder underneath it. She said, "You're going to put Mom through a psychiatric evaluation while she is dying, because you're upset about the house." I said, "I'm going to make sure our mother's final wishes actually reflect what our mother wants." "Yes," Sandra said. She told me herself, Diane, sitting in that kitchen. She said she wanted me to have the house because I was the one who would keep the family together. Those were her words. I said, "When did she say that, Sandra?" She said, "What?" I said, "What day? What time? What were the exact circumstances? Was it morning or afternoon? Had she taken her midday medication?" Sandra stared at me. She said, "I can't believe you're doing this." I said, "I can't believe you scheduled a legal appointment without telling me and took our medicated mother to change her will 3 weeks after you arrived after 14 months of absence." But here we are. That was the most I had said out loud about any of it. Sandra's eyes went wet. Not from guilt, I didn't think. From something more like shock. The shock of someone who had always been able to navigate situations with warmth and charm, discovering that those tools had a limit. She said, "I love Mom too, Diane." I said, "I know you do, Sandra. This isn't about love. It's about what's right." She went inside. I sat on the back porch for a long time after. Savannah in November. That particular smell of the marsh at night. Spanish moss in the dark trees. I thought about Daddy planting that magnolia tree in the front yard before I was born. Thought about Mom in her blue cardigan going down the porch steps on Harold's appointment day. Thought about her hand on mine before her nap. "You are such a good girl, Diane. You always have been." I picked up my phone. Added everything to my notes. Then I texted Catherine. "Sandra knows. She's upset. Evaluation's still on track?" Catherine replied in 6 minutes. Dr. Sharma confirmed for the 28th. Stay steady, Diane. We're doing this correctly. Stay steady. I had been steady for 14 months. I could manage 10 more days. The 10 days between that Wednesday evening and Dr. Sharma's evaluation were the longest of my life. Not because of the legal situation. Not because of Sandra. Because of Mom. She had a bad week. The worst since I had moved back to Savannah. 3 nights where the pain broke through the medication and Patricia had to adjust the dosing protocol. 2 days where she barely left her bed. 1 morning where she didn't recognize me for about 40 seconds when she first woke up and then came back and squeezed my hand and said, "Diane, I had the strangest dream." I said, "It's okay, Mama. I'm here." She said, "I know you're a baby. You're always here." Sandra and I existed in a careful parallel during those 10 days. Both of us in the same house. Both of us caring for Mom in our separate ways. Neither of us saying anything further about Harold Briggs or Dr. Sharma or the house on Hartridge Street. We were civil. We were even kind sometimes. At Mom's bedside, we were simply her daughters. Whatever was happening between us stopped at the doorway of her room. That was the one thing Sandra and I had always agreed on without discussing it. Mom came first. Dr. Sharma arrived on a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. She was exactly what I had hoped for. 50s. Unhurried. The kind of physician who made you feel like she had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do than this specific conversation. She spent 45 minutes with Mom. I was present for part of it. Sandra was not. Catherine had advised that neither daughter be present for the full evaluation to avoid influencing the results. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the quiet murmur of conversation from Mom's room. Couldn't make out words. Just tone. Mom's voice. Dr. Sharma's voice. Back and forth. At one point Mom laughed at something. That laugh. That specific laugh that I had known my entire life. I looked at the kitchen table where Mom had made biscuits every Sunday morning for 40 years. Sandra came in from the backyard where she had been waiting. She poured herself water at the sink. We didn't speak. Dr. Sharma came out at 10:52 a.m. She asked to speak with me privately first. We went to the back porch. She said, "Ms. Calloway, your mother is a remarkable woman." I said, "Yes, she is." She said, "I want to give you my honest assessment. Your mother is cognitively compromised. Not severely. Not completely. But the combination of her illness progression and her pain medication creates significant variability in her capacity. There are windows of clarity and windows where her judgment and her ability to resist influence are genuinely impaired." I said, "And the appointment with Harold Briggs was at 2 p.m. Dr. Sharma said, "Midday medication peak sedation." "Yes. I noted that in my assessment." She said, "I cannot say definitively that your mother did not want to make those changes. She may well have wanted to. But I can say that the circumstances under which those changes were made did not represent optimal conditions for fully independent decision-making." I said, "What does that mean legally?" She said, "That's for your attorney to determine. But my written assessment will reflect the cognitive variability and the timing concern." I thanked her. She went back inside to speak briefly with Sandra. I stayed on the back porch. The Savannah morning was cool and clear. A mockingbird was doing something complicated in the oak tree at the back of the yard. I called Catherine immediately. She listened to everything Dr. Sharma had said. Then she said, "Diane, this is enough. Combined with the timing documentation and the medication records, this gives us a solid foundation to challenge the amendment." I said, "What happens now?" Catherine said, "I contact Harold Briggs formally. We present Dr. Sharma's assessment. We request that the original will be reinstated pending further review. Harold is a careful attorney. He will not want his name on a document that was signed under compromised conditions. My guess is he'll recommend your mother reconsider with proper safeguards in place." I said, "And Sandra?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. She said, "Sandra will have the opportunity to be present for any future will discussions. As will you. With proper protocols. Proper timing. Full documentation." I said, "Okay." Catherine said, "Diane, you did everything right. You documented. You moved quickly. You got the evaluation done while your mother is still here. That matters enormously." I said, "I just want it to be right, Catherine. Whatever Mom actually wants. I just want it to be what she actually wants." Catherine said, "I know. That's why you're going to win this." I hung up. Went back inside. Mom was sitting up in bed when I looked in. Better than she'd been all week. That particular morning clarity she sometimes had. She looked at me in the doorway. She said, "Diane Marie, come sit with me." I sat on the edge of her bed. She took my hand, both of hers around mine the way she had done since I was small. She said, "I want to talk to you about some things. Important things." While I'm thinking clearly, I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "I think I may have made some decisions recently that weren't entirely my own." The room was very quiet. I said, "Mama." She said, "Let me finish." She squeezed my hand. I love Sandra. I love her completely. But I know the difference between what I want and what someone helps me want. And I think I need to talk to Harold again. With you there this time. I looked at my mother. 74 years old. Dying. Still the sharpest woman in any room when the medication wasn't clouding things. I said, "Okay, Mama. I'll call Harold today." She nodded. Then she looked at our hands together. She said, "You know what your daddy used to say about you?" I said, "What?" She said, "He used to say Diane is the one who will still be standing when everything else falls down." She looked up at me. "He was right," she said. "He was always right about you." I called Harold Briggs that same afternoon. Mom was resting after lunch. Sandra had gone to the Publix on Abercorn for groceries. The house was quiet in that particular way it got in the early afternoon when the Savannah light came through the front windows at a low angle and made everything look still. Harold answered on the second ring. I said, "Harold, my mother would like to meet with you again. With me present this time. She has some things she wants to discuss regarding the recent amendment." A pause. Harold said, "I see. Has she indicated what specifically she'd like to address?" I said, "She wants to make sure her will reflects her actual wishes." Her words, Harold. Not mine. Another pause. Longer. He said, "I received Catherine Morse's correspondence this morning. And Dr. Sharma's preliminary assessment." I said, "I assumed you had." He said, "Diane, I want you to know that if I had any indication at the time of the appointment that your mother's capacity was compromised, I would not have proceeded. I take that responsibility very seriously." I said, "I understand, Harold. I'm not questioning your integrity. I'm asking for another meeting. With proper timing. Morning. Before her midday medication. With me present." He said, "I think that's entirely appropriate. I'll have my office call to schedule." He called back within the hour. Thursday morning. 10 a.m., 3 days away. I didn't tell Sandra that night. I know how that sounds. But I had watched what happened when Sandra had advance notice of a legal appointment involving Mom's estate, and I was not going to make the same mistake twice. I told Mom, sitting on the edge of her bed after her evening medications. Quietly. Just the two of us. Mom nodded. Said, "Good. Thursday morning. I'll be sharp in the morning." She was right about that. Mornings were her best time. Before the pain built through the day and the medication accumulated in her system. Wednesday passed slowly. Sandra made dinner. Chicken and rice. Mom's recipe from the index card box she kept in the third drawer of the kitchen. Sandra had found it the first week and used it carefully like she was handling something fragile. We ate together at the kitchen table. The three of us. Mom eating a little more than she had been. Sandra telling a story about something one of her kids had said on the phone that made Mom laugh. I watched them across the table. My sister. My mother. Whatever Sandra had done. She loved Mom. I knew that. I had never doubted that. Love and wrongdoing are not mutually exclusive. People do harmful things to people they love all the time. Usually because of fear. Usually because of something they need that they don't know how to ask for directly. Sandra was afraid of losing Mom. So was I. The difference was what we had each done with that fear. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. Mom was up at 8 a.m. Dressed in her good blue cardigan again. The same one she had worn to Harold's office the first time. I wondered if she had chosen it deliberately. She probably had. Mom was deliberate about most things when she was thinking clearly. I helped her with her morning medications. 8:15 a.m. Harold's office at 10. Plenty of time for the medication to settle before the appointment. Sandra came downstairs at 8:45. She saw Mom dressed. Saw my keys on the kitchen counter. She said, "Where are you going?" Mom said, "Harold's office, sweetheart. Diane is taking me." Sandra looked at me. I looked back at her steadily. She said, "I'd like to come." Mom said, I know, baby. But I need to do this one with Diane. You understand. Sandra's face did something complicated and painful and entirely human. She said, Mom. Mom said, Sandra Louise. I love you. And I need you to trust me on this one. Sandra looked at our mother for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Small. She said, Okay, Mama. She went back upstairs. I helped Mom down the porch steps. Into the passenger seat of my Subaru. Buckled her seatbelt the way I always did. She looked out the window as I backed down the driveway. She said, Your daddy planted that tree the year you were born, did you know that? I said, You've told me, Mama. Many times. She said, I never get tired of saying it. I looked in the rearview mirror as we pulled onto Hartridge Street. The magnolia tree standing in the morning light in the front yard of the house my parents had built their life in. I said, Neither do I, Mama. We drove to Harold Briggs' office in the Savannah morning. And my mother went in to say what she actually meant. Harold Briggs' office was on Bull Street in downtown Savannah. Third floor of a brick building that had been there since before I was born. Dark wood paneling. The smell of old books and good coffee. The kind of office that made you feel like whatever happened inside it would be handled with care. Harold met us at the elevator himself. He shook Mom's hand gently. Said, Eleanor, it's good to see you. Mom said, Harold, you look the same as you did 30 years ago. He smiled. Said, You're being kind. He led us to the conference room. Not his office. The conference room with the long table and the chairs with proper arms that Mom could use to steady herself. He had water waiting. And a small plate of shortbread cookies because he remembered from 40 years of knowing our family that Mom had a particular weakness for shortbread. That detail made my chest hurt in a way I hadn't expected. We sat down. Mom across from Harold. Me beside her. Harold folded his hands on the table. He said, Eleanor, Diane tells me you have some things you'd like to revisit regarding the amendment we processed last week. Mom nodded. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. That particular posture she used when she was being deliberate. She said, Harold, I want to ask you something first. And I need you to answer me honestly the way you answered Thomas honestly for 30 years. Harold said, Of course, Eleanor. Mom said, When I came in last week, how did I seem to you? Honestly. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You seemed like yourself, Eleanor. But I'll admit the timing of the appointment concerned me in retrospect. Afternoons aren't always. Mom said, I was medicated, Harold. I know I was. I could feel it. Everything had that softness to it, like thinking through water. Harold said nothing. Mom said, I love my daughter, Sandra. I want that in the record. I love her completely. But I have 2 daughters. And one of them has been sleeping in my house and driving me to my appointments and holding my hand at 3 a.m. for 14 months. And the other one arrived 3 weeks ago. The conference room was very quiet. Mom said, I want the will restored to what it was. Everything equal. The house split between both my girls the way Thomas and I always intended. That is what I want, Harold. When I am thinking clearly. Which I am right now. Harold looked at my mother for a long moment. Then he said, I'll draw up the restoration documents today, Eleanor. We can execute them before you leave if you feel up to it. Mom said, I feel up to it. It took 40 minutes. Harold's paralegal brought in the documents. Harold walked Mom through every page. Every line. Asked her 3 times in 3 different ways whether she understood what she was signing and whether it reflected her actual wishes. Each time Mom said, Yes, Harold. This is what I want. She signed with the same steady hand she had used to sign my permission slips and my college applications and my nursing school forms. Harold notarized everything. Made copies. Handed Mom the originals in a manila envelope. She handed the envelope to me. She said, You hold on to that. I took it. Harold walked us back to the elevator himself. At the door he shook Mom's hand again. He said, Eleanor, it has been an honor knowing your family. Mom patted his hand. She said, You were always a good man, Harold. Thomas always said so. In the elevator going down, Mom leaned slightly against my shoulder. She said, That feels better. I said, Good, Mama. She said, I should have brought you the first time. I said, It's okay, Mama. She said, No, it isn't. But we fixed it. That's what matters. The elevator opened. We walked through the lobby, through the front door into the Savannah morning. I helped her into the passenger seat. buckled her seatbelt. She held the door before I closed it. She said, "Diane, whatever happens after I'm gone, I need you to remember something." I looked at her. She said, "I see you. I have always seen you, even when I didn't say it enough." I closed the door carefully, walked around to the driver's side, sat down, put both hands on the wheel, and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds before I started the car. Sandra was sitting on the front porch when we got home. Rocking chair. The one Daddy had made by hand the summer before I was born. She was holding a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. Looking at the magnolia tree in the yard the way you look at something when you're not really seeing it. She heard the car. Looked up. I helped Mom up the porch steps. Mom stopped at Sandra's chair. Put her hand on Sandra's shoulder. She said, "Come inside, baby. I need to talk to both my girls." Sandra looked at Mom's face. Then at mine. She stood up without saying anything. We went inside. The three of us. Into the living room where we had watched Wheel of Fortune and eaten Sunday dinners and opened Christmas presents for as long as any of us could remember. Mom sat in her chair. The recliner by the window that had been hers for 20 years. The one that still had the small burn mark on the armrest from when Daddy had set his coffee down too fast one Thanksgiving, and they had laughed about it for years after. Sandra and I sat on the couch across from her. Mom looked at both of us for a long moment. Then she said, "I went to see Harold this morning. With Diane. And I made some changes." Sandra said nothing. But something moved across her face. Mom said, "I changed it back, Sandra. The way it was before. Everything equal between you and your sister. The house. The accounts. Everything." Sandra's jaw tightened slightly. She said, "Mama." Mom said, "Let me finish." She said it gently but firmly. The way she had said it to both of us our entire lives. She said, "I love you, Sandra Louise. You are my firstborn, and there is nothing in this world that changes that. But what happened last week was not right. And I think somewhere in yourself you know that." Sandra looked at her hands in her lap. Mom said, "I was not myself last week. And I think you knew that too. And I think you told yourself it was okay because you love me and because you were scared and because you wanted something to hold on to after I'm gone. And I understand all of that. I do." Sandra's eyes were wet. Mom said, "But that house belongs to both my girls. Your daddy and I built that life together for both of you. And I will not leave this world with it any other way." The living room was completely quiet. Then Sandra said, "I'm sorry, Mama." Her voice was barely there. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to lose you, and I thought if I had the house it would be like." She stopped. Couldn't finish. Mom said, "I know, baby. I know exactly what you thought." She reached across the space between them. Sandra leaned forward and took her hand. They stayed like that for a moment. Mom and Sandra. The way they had always been. Warm and easy and connected in a way that had sometimes left me on the outside looking in. Then Mom reached her other hand toward me. I took it. And for the first time in as long as I could remember. The three of us were in the same room, and nobody was on the outside. Mom looked at both of us. She said, "I need you two to promise me something. After I'm gone, promise me you won't let any of this." She paused. "Any of what almost happened. Become what you remember. Promise me you'll be sisters. Real ones." Sandra looked at me. I looked at Sandra. 36 years of being her sister. 36 years of Sunday phone calls, an unequal weight, and a legal appointment I almost missed, and a will I had to fight to restore. And underneath all of it, under every bit of it, my sister. The person I had shared every family memory with. Every loss. Every holiday table. I said, "I promise, Mama." Sandra said, "I promise." Mom squeezed both our hands at once. She said, "Good. Now somebody make me a cup of tea. My throat is dry from all that talking." Sandra laughed first. Then I did. And the sound of it filled that living room the way laughter had always filled it when our family was whole. Mom passed on a Saturday morning in December. 6 weeks after the day we sat in that living room, and she made us promise. It was early. Just after 5 a.m. That particular darkness before dawn that feels different from the darkness at midnight. Quieter somehow. More final. Patricia had warned me the night before. She had that particular knowing that comes from years of hospice work. The kind of knowledge that lives in the body, not the mind. She said, "Diane, I think tonight you should stay close." I stayed close. I was sitting in the chair beside Mom's bed when she went. Sandra was on the other side. both of us holding one of her hands in the dark. Mom didn't struggle, didn't fight it. She had made her peace weeks before in ways both practical and private. She had said what she needed to say, fixed what she needed to fix, held the hands she needed to hold. She just let go, the way she had always done everything. Quietly, on her own terms. Patricia came in at 5:23 a.m. Checked. Noted the time. Put her hand briefly on my shoulder and Sandra's shoulder in turn without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Sandra and I sat with Mom for a long time after. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing urgent to do. No phone calls that couldn't wait an hour. No decisions that needed to be made in the next 60 minutes. Just the two of us. In that room. With our mother. For the last time. At some point Sandra reached across Mom's bed and took my hand. Just that. No words. I held on. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Forsyth Park Baptist Church, where Mom had attended for 42 years. The same church where she and Daddy had gotten married. Where Sandra and I had been baptized. Where Daddy's funeral had been 8 years before. 214 people came. I know because the funeral director told me afterward, and I wrote it in my notes the way I had written everything for the past 6 weeks. Not out of habit anymore. Just because it felt like something Mom would have wanted recorded. Eleanor Calloway. Loved by 214 people who showed up on a Wednesday in December to say so. The reception afterward was at the house on Hartridge Street. Mom's church friends filled every room. The kitchen counter disappeared under casserole dishes and pound cakes, and the particular abundance of food that Southern women bring to grief like it can help. Maybe it can. It helped a little. I stood in the kitchen doorway at one point and watched Sandra moving through the living room, talking to relatives, accepting hugs, doing that thing she had always done, making a room feel held together. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She caught my eye across the room. Something passed between us. Not words. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. That would take longer. Real forgiveness always does. Just recognition. The kind that only exists between people who have shared something that changed them both. She nodded slightly. I nodded back. 3 months later, Sandra flew back to Phoenix. The house on Hartridge Street went through probate. Catherine handled everything with the precision and care I had come to expect from her. The will was clean. Uncontested. Everything equal the way Mom had wanted. Sandra and I agreed without much discussion to keep the house for now. Rent it to a young family from the church who needed the space. Split the income equally. Revisit the decision in a year. It wasn't a permanent solution. But it was a right one. For now. I went back to Charlotte in February. Back to nursing. Back to the life I had put in a storage unit on I-485 14 months earlier. It fit differently when I unpacked it. Not worse. Just different. The way you are always different after you have sat with someone you love while they leave the world. I called Sandra on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks after I was back. She answered on the first ring. We talked for 40 minutes. About Mom. About the house. About Kevin and the kids and how strange it felt to call on a Tuesday without Mom being the reason. At the end of the call, Sandra said, "Diane." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm sorry. For what I did. I've been trying to figure out how to say it properly for months, and I don't think there's a proper way. So I'm just saying it. I'm sorry." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Sandra. I know you are." She said, "Are we okay?" I thought about Mom's living room. Both our hands in hers. The promise we had made. I said, "We're getting there. That's enough for right now." She said, "Yeah, that's enough." We said goodnight. I sat in my Charlotte apartment in the February dark. Mom's manila envelope on the bookshelf where I could see it from the couch. The will inside it. Restored. Equal. The way it was always supposed to be. On the bookshelf next to it was a photograph. The three of us from the last Christmas before the diagnosis. Mom in the middle. Sandra on one side. Me on the other. The magnolia tree visible through the window behind us. Mom was smiling in that photo. That specific smile. Warm and entirely hers. I had always seen it directed at Sandra more than me. Or maybe I had just been looking at the wrong thing. Maybe she had been smiling at all of it. At both of us. At the whole complicated imperfect life she had built with the people she loved. Maybe I had always been seen. I just hadn't always known how to let myself believe it. I did now. If you have ever been the one who stayed. The one who showed up. The one who did the hard thing quietly while someone else got the credit. This story was for you. You are seen. More than you know. Drop a comment below and tell me what time it is where you are right now. Tell me if you would have fought for that will. Tell me if you've ever been in Diane's shoes. And if this story moved you. If it felt real. Because it is real. Subscribe to Honor Unveiled. We tell stories about real strength, real justice, real family. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. This has been Honor Unveiled, and we'll see you in the next one.